The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine marble steps of the state capitol, where hundreds of uniformed officers stood in perfect formation, their polished badges gleaming like mirrors. The annual police memorial ceremony was the most sacred event in law enforcement, a moment when the thin blue line gathered to honor their fallen brothers and sisters. The silence was profound, almost sacred, broken only by the distant flutter of flags in the gentle breeze. Officer Marcus Sullivan stood in the third row, his weathered hands resting at his sides as he fought to maintain his composure. 23. Years on the force had taught him to compartmentalize grief, to lock away the pain until he could process it in private. But today was different. Today the weight of loss pressed against his chest like a physical force, threatening to crack the careful facade he'd built over the past 6 months. Beside him, Zeus, his German shepherd partner of 8 years, sat, perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed ahead with the discipline that had made him legendary among canine units across 3 states. The dog's coat gleamed black and tan in the morning light, every muscle coiled with controlled power. Zeus had been trained to maintain position during ceremonies, to represent the canine division with unwavering professionalism. He'd done it dozens of times before, a living symbol of loyalty and service. The ceremony began with the traditional call to attention. 500 officers snapped to perfect posture in unison, their movements synchronized like a military ballet. The chaplain stepped forward, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd as he began the invocation. Marcus felt his throat tighten as the familiar words washed over him. Words about sacrifice, about heroes who gave their lives in service to others, about the bonds that transcended death itself. Commissioner Roberts approached the podium, his silver hair catching the light as he prepared to read the names of officers killed in the line of duty over the past year. The list had grown longer than anyone wanted to acknowledge. 15 names that would be etched into granite, 15 families forever changed, 15 empty chairs at dinner tables across the state. We gather today not in sorrow, but in remembrance. The commissioner's voice boomed across the plaza. These men and women answered the call to serve, knowing the risks, accepting the responsibility, embracing the sacred duty that binds us all together. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, his partner's name echoing in his mind like a prayer. Detective Ray Hoffman, shot 3 times responding to a domestic violence call on a rainy Tuesday evening in November. Gone at 42, leaving behind a wife, 2 teenage daughters, and a grief so raw it still caught Marcus off guard at unexpected moments. The color guard began their march toward the memorial wall, carrying flags representing every fallen officer. This was the moment when Zeus should have performed his signature move, a precise military salute, his right paw lifting to his forehead in perfect mimicry of his human counterparts. The crowd always responded with appreciation, a brief moment of lightness in an otherwise solemn ceremony. Marcus gave Zeus the subtle hand signal they'd practiced countless times. The dog's ears perked forward, acknowledging the command. But instead of lifting his paw in salute, Zeus did something that made Marcus's blood run cold. The German shepherd's entire body went rigid, his hackles rising along his spine as a low, almost inaudible growl rumbled in his throat. His dark eyes weren't focused on the flags or the memorial wall, they were locked onto someone in the crowd. Someone who had triggered an instinct so powerful that years of training couldn't suppress it. Zeus took a half-step forward, his nose working the air with urgent intensity. The growl grew slightly louder, causing several nearby officers to glance over with concern. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he followed his partner's gaze, scanning the faces in the crowd for whatever had captured the dog's attention so completely. "Zeus down," Marcus whispered, using their code for immediate compliance. But for the first time in 8 years of partnership, Zeus didn't obey. Instead, the dog's tail dropped low, his entire posture shifting into something Marcus had only seen in the most dangerous situations, when Zeus had detected explosives, or when he'd cornered armed suspects in dark alleys. The ceremony continued around them, but Marcus felt as if time had slowed to a crawl. Something was wrong, terribly, fundamentally wrong, and somehow Zeus knew exactly what it was. 8 years. Earlier, Marcus Sullivan had been a different man, bitter, cynical, counting down the days until his pension kicked in. The job had worn him down like sandpaper on stone. Each case of domestic violence, each drug bust, each senseless act of violence chipping away at whatever idealism he'd carried into the academy 23 years before. He'd been partnered with human officers who'd burned out, transferred, or simply stopped caring. The revolving door of the police department had left him isolated, going through the motions without the fire that had once driven him to make a difference. His marriage had ended 2 years earlier. Janet couldn't handle the long hours, the missed dinners, the way he'd come home and sit in silence, staring at the wall as if seeing ghosts she couldn't understand. The K9 program had been Commissioner Robert's idea, a way to revitalize community relations and enhance the department's capabilities. Marcus had volunteered partly out of boredom, partly because working with dogs seemed easier than working with people. He'd figured a dog couldn't disappoint him, couldn't betray his trust, couldn't decide one day that the job wasn't worth the sacrifice. He'd been wrong about that, but in the best possible way. Zeus had arrived from a specialized training facility in Colorado, already 3 years old and certified in narcotics detection, suspect apprehension and search and rescue. The dog's previous handler had been killed in a car accident, and Zeus carried a wariness that Marcus recognized immediately. The careful distance of someone who'd learned that attachment led to loss. Their first weeks together had been a careful dance of mutual assessment. Zeus was professional but detached, following commands with mechanical precision while keeping his emotional walls firmly in place. Marcus had found himself talking to the dog during long patrol shifts, sharing observations about cases, complaints, about department politics, memories of better days when being a cop had felt like a calling instead of just a job. The breakthrough had come during their first major case together, a missing child in the industrial district, a 7-year-old girl who'd wandered away from her grandmother's house and vanished into a maze of abandoned warehouses. The search had stretched into its second day when Zeus suddenly went rigid during a routine sweep, his nose working frantically at the base of a collapsed loading dock. Marcus had learned to read his partner's body language by then, and something in Zeus's posture suggested urgency beyond their normal protocols. Against direct orders to maintain the search grid, Marcus had followed Zeus's lead as the dog scrambled over debris and squeezed through a gap in the concrete structure. They'd found little Amy Castellanos unconscious, but breathing in a hidden basement room, dehydrated and hypothermic but alive. She'd fallen through rotted floorboards and couldn't climb out, her voice too weak to carry to the search teams above. Without Zeus's instinctive detection of her scent trail, she would have died within hours. The moment Marcus lifted the child into the sunlight, Zeus had done something unexpected. He'd gently licked her face, his tail wagging for the first time since they'd been partnered. And when Amy had opened her eyes and wrapped her small arms around the big dog's neck, whispering, "Good boy," in a voice barely above a whisper, Marcus had felt something crack open in his chest that he'd thought was permanently sealed. That night, for the first time in months, he'd called Janet, not to argue or negotiate or assign blame, but simply to tell her about the little girl and the way Zeus had refused to give up when everyone else was ready to expand the search to neighboring counties. Janet had cried on the phone, not from sadness but from recognition of the man she'd married, the one who'd disappeared somewhere in the grinding machinery of police work. Over the following years, Marcus and Zeus had become legendary within the department. They'd solved cases that had baffled detectives for months, tracked suspects through terrain that would have stopped human officers, and saved lives in situations where minutes made the difference between tragedy and miracle. But more than their professional success, they'd developed a bond that transcended the usual handler-dog relationship. Zeus had learned to read Marcus's moods with uncanny accuracy, offering comfort during difficult cases and celebrating victories with tail-wagging enthusiasm. Marcus had discovered that caring for his partner, ensuring Zeus got proper nutrition, exercise, medical care, and affection had rekindled his capacity for compassion in ways that surprised him daily. The dog slept in Marcus's bedroom, rode shotgun in the patrol car, and had become such an integral part of his life that Marcus couldn't imagine existence without him. Zeus had been there during the divorce proceedings, offering silent support when the loneliness threatened to overwhelm everything else. He'd been there when Marcus's father died, somehow sensing the grief and staying close without being asked. Most importantly, Zeus had been there 6 months ago on the worst night of Marcus's career, when everything he thought he knew about loyalty and trust had been shattered beyond repair. The memory of that night still hit him like a physical blow. Detective Ray Hoffman bleeding out on a rain-soaked sidewalk while Marcus and Zeus worked frantically to stop the hemorrhaging, waiting for paramedics who would arrive 3 minutes too late. Ray had been Marcus's closest friend on the force, the one person who'd never stopped believing that police work could be a force for good in the world. As Ray died in his arms, he'd whispered something that Marcus couldn't quite hear over the sirens and the chaos. Something about being sorry, about things not being what they seemed, about Marcus needing to watch his back. Zeus had whined softly throughout the entire ordeal, as if he understood that they were losing more than just a colleague. They were losing a piece of themselves. Now, standing at the memorial ceremony, Marcus realized that Zeus's strange behavior might be connected to that terrible night in ways he wasn't ready to understand. The ceremony continued with military precision, but Marcus felt increasingly disconnected from the formal proceedings. Zeus's continued alertness had created a bubble of tension around them, drawing glances from nearby officers who'd never seen the normally disciplined K9 behave so erratically. Captain Linda Morrison, who supervised the K9 unit, approached with concern etched across her weathered features. She'd been working with police dogs for 15 years and had developed an almost supernatural ability to read K9 behavior. What she saw in Zeus's posture clearly troubled her. "Everything okay?" "Sullivan?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the chaplain's continuing invocation. "Zeus seems agitated." Marcus nodded toward the crowd where Zeus's attention remained fixed. "He's tracking something, someone. I've never seen him like this during a ceremony." Morrison followed their line of sight, scanning the assembled officers, city officials, and family members who'd gathered to honor the fallen. Nothing appeared out of place. Uniformed personnel standing at attention, grieving widows clutching memorial programs, children fidgeting in their formal clothes while trying to understand why everyone looked so sad. "Any idea what's triggered?" "Him?" Morrison asked, her hand moving instinctively to her radio. After 2 decades in law enforcement, she'd learned to trust the instincts of both her human and canine officers. If Zeus sensed something wrong, it deserved serious attention. Before Marcus could answer, Zeus made a sound that chilled everyone within earshot. Not quite a bark, not quite a howl, but something primal that seemed to rise from the depths of his soul. Several officers turned in their direction, and Marcus felt heat rising in his cheeks as he realized they were becoming a distraction during one of the most solemn moments in the law enforcement calendar. "Zeus, quiet," Marcus commanded, using his most authoritative tone. But the dog's focus remained unbroken, his dark eyes locked onto something or someone in the crowd with laser intensity. Detective Sarah Chen, who'd worked several cases with Marcus and Zeus, stepped closer with obvious concern. She'd developed tremendous respect for Zeus's abilities over the years, and his current behavior sent warning signals through her investigative instincts. "Marcus, is he alerting on something specific?" Chen asked, her voice pitched low to avoid drawing more attention. "Drug detection? Explosives?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted, feeling increasingly helpless. "This isn't his normal alert behavior for narcotics or weapons. This is something else entirely." Commissioner Roberts had begun reading the names of fallen officers, his voice carrying across the plaza with ceremonial gravity. Each name was followed by a moment of silence, a bell toll, and the ceremonial folding of a flag. The rhythm was hypnotic, designed to honor the dead while providing comfort to the living. But Zeus seemed oblivious to the ceremony itself. His entire being was focused on whatever had captured his attention, and his agitation was growing more pronounced with each passing minute. His breathing had become rapid and shallow, his muscles coiled as if preparing for action. Officer Tommy Rodriguez, a rookie who'd always been somewhat intimidated by Zeus's reputation, whispered to his partner, "What's wrong with the dog?" Looks like he's about to attack someone." The comment carried further than Rodriguez intended, and several nearby officers began shifting nervously. Marcus realized that Zeus's behavior was not only disrupting the ceremony, but creating genuine concern among his colleagues. Some were starting to eye the crowd more carefully, wondering if the K9 had detected a genuine threat. Marcus knelt beside his partner, placing a gentle hand on Zeus's flank while trying to project calm authority. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "Whatever. It is, we'll handle it, but not here, not now." For a moment, Zeus seemed to respond to his handler's touch. The dog's rigid posture relaxed slightly, and his breathing slowed. But then, as if triggered by some invisible signal, Zeus's head snapped toward a different section of the crowd, his attention shifting with startling intensity. Marcus followed the dog's gaze and felt his stomach clench. Zeus was now focused on a group of senior department officials, captains, lieutenants, and deputy commissioners who'd gathered near the VIP section. Among them stood Assistant Chief Harold Brennan, a 30-year veteran who'd climbed the ranks through a combination of political skill and carefully managed cases. Brennan was speaking quietly with City Councilman Robert Vance, their heads bent together in what appeared to be routine conversation. Both men were pillars of the local law enforcement community, respected figures who'd dedicated their careers to public service. There was absolutely nothing suspicious about their presence or behavior, but Zeus's reaction to them was unmistakable. The dog's hackles rose again and that low growl returned, more insistent than before. His tail dropped low and his ears flattened against his head, body language that Marcus recognized as indicating extreme caution, possibly even fear. "What the hell?" Marcus whispered, unable to reconcile Zeus's behavior with what he was seeing. Brennan had always been supportive of the K9 program, and Vance had voted for increased funding for police equipment just last year. Both men had attended Ray Hoffman's funeral, offering condolences and support during the worst period of Marcus's career. Captain Morrison had been watching the interaction carefully, and her expression had grown increasingly grave. "Marcus, I think we need to remove Zeus from the ceremony. Whatever's bothering him, it's becoming a distraction." Marcus nodded reluctantly, knowing she was right but feeling frustrated by the timing. The memorial ceremony was important to him, a chance to honor Ray's memory and find some closure after months of grief. But Zeus's welfare had to take priority, and his current state was clearly causing distress to both the dog and everyone around them. As Marcus prepared to lead Zeus away from the formation, the dog did something that stopped him cold. Without any command or signal, Zeus suddenly sat down, raised his right paw and held it against his forehead in a perfect military salute. Not toward the flag or the memorial wall, but directly toward the section where Brennan and Vance were standing. The gesture was so unexpected, so precisely executed, that several nearby officers gasped audibly. Zeus held the salute for exactly 3 seconds, then lowered his paw and returned to his alert posture, his eyes never leaving the two officials. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what he'd just witnessed. Zeus hadn't been refusing to salute during the ceremony. He'd been waiting to salute someone specific, someone who'd earned his attention for reasons that Marcus was only beginning to understand. The drive back to the station was tense and silent, Zeus riding in his usual position in the passenger seat, but maintaining an alertness that made Marcus increasingly uncomfortable. Every few minutes, the dog would turn to look directly at his handler, as if trying to communicate something beyond the limits of their usual signals and commands. Marcus pulled into the station parking lot and sat for a moment, engine running, trying to process what had happened at the ceremony. In 8 years of partnership, Zeus had never behaved so erratically in public. The dog's instincts had proven reliable in hundreds of situations, from routine traffic stops to life-threatening emergencies. If Zeus sensed something wrong, there was probably something genuinely wrong. But the target of Zeus's attention made no sense. Assistant Chief Brennan and Councilman Vance were respected figures in the community, men who'd built their careers on public service and ethical leadership. The idea that either of them could be involved in something that would trigger Zeus's protective instincts seemed absurd. Unless Marcus felt a memory tugging at the edges of his consciousness, something from the night Ray Hoffman died, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now carried different weight in light of Zeus's behavior. He closed his eyes and forced himself to relive that terrible evening, ignoring the familiar stab of pain that accompanied thoughts of his dead friend. Ray had called him around 9:30, his voice tight with excitement and something else, anxiety, maybe even fear. "Marcus, I need to see you. Tonight. It's about the Henderson case." The Henderson case. Marcus remembered it clearly. A domestic violence situation that had escalated into a hostage standoff 6 months earlier. Ray had been the lead detective, and the case had been closed after the suspect, William Henderson, had been shot and killed during the rescue operation. Henderson's wife had been saved, but barely, and the incident had generated significant media attention about police response to domestic violence calls. Ray had seemed satisfied with the case resolution at the time. Henderson had been a repeat offender with a history of violence against women, and his death had been ruled justified by both internal affairs and the district attorney's office. But Ray's phone call that night had suggested otherwise. "There's something wrong with the official report," Ray had said. "Something that doesn't add up. I've been going through the evidence again and I found—" The call had been interrupted by his radio. A domestic violence call in progress, shots fired. Ray had to respond immediately, standard protocol for all available units. He'd promised to brief Marcus later, after they'd handled the emergency, but there had been no later. Ray had walked into what appeared to be a routine domestic violence call and walked into a trap that cost him his life. The shooter, identified as Jerome Washington, a career criminal with outstanding warrants, had been killed during the subsequent firefight. Case closed. Another tragic example of the dangers law enforcement officers faced every day. Except now Marcus wondered if there had been more to it. He opened his eyes and looked at Zeus, who was watching him with that peculiar intensity that had become so familiar over the years. The dog seemed to sense that his handler was working through something important, and his tail wagged once briefly, in encouragement. "What do you know that I don't, boy?" Marcus whispered. Zeus's response was immediate and startling. The dog began to whine softly, a sound Marcus associated with Zeus's attempts to alert him to hidden contraband or concealed weapons. But they were sitting in an empty parking lot. There was nothing here that should trigger that kind of response, unless Zeus was responding to the memory itself, to some scent or association that Marcus couldn't detect, but the dog remembered. With perfect clarity, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message. The sender was listed as unknown, but the content made his blood run cold. "Your partner knows. Meet me at Riverside Park midnight. Come alone. Your friend Ray was getting too close to the truth. Don't make the same mistake." Marcus stared at the message, reading it 3 times before the implications fully sank in. Someone had been watching him, had seen Zeus's behavior at the ceremony, and was now threatening both of them. Worse, the message suggested that Ray's death hadn't been random, that his friend had been killed because he'd uncovered something dangerous. Zeus suddenly barked once, sharp and urgent, his attention focused on the station entrance. Marcus looked up to see Assistant Chief Brennan walking toward his patrol car, his expression friendly, but his eyes carrying something that hadn't been there during the ceremony: calculation, assessment, maybe even concern. "Sullivan, Brennan," called out as he approached. "Heard you had some trouble with Zeus during the ceremony. Everything okay?" Marcus forced his voice to remain steady. "Just an off day, sir. He's been a little stressed since Ray's death. Sometimes the ceremonies bring back difficult memories." Brennan nodded sympathetically, but his gaze lingered on Zeus, who had gone completely still in the passenger seat. The dog's eyes were fixed on the assistant chief with that same intense focus he'd displayed during the ceremony. "I understand completely," Brennan said. "Losing a partner is never easy, whether they're human or canine. Ray was a good detective, a thorough investigator, sometimes maybe too thorough for his own good." The comment seemed innocuous enough, but something in Brennan's tone made Marcus's pulse quicken. Zeus must have sensed the change in his handler's stress level, because the dog's hackles began to rise again, creating a ridge of fur along his spine. "Zeus, easy," Marcus said quietly, but the dog's attention remained locked on Brennan. The assistant chief noticed Zeus's reaction and took a small step back. That's quite a partner you have there. Very observant. I hope his instincts don't lead him into situations he can't handle. The warning was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus felt his mouth go dry as he realized that Brennan might be the source of the threatening text message, might be involved in whatever had gotten Ray killed. Zeus has always been able to handle himself, Marcus replied carefully. He's got good instincts about people, rarely wrong about who to trust. Brennan's smile didn't reach his eyes. Well, make sure those instincts don't get either of you into trouble. The department has already lost too many good officers this year. As the assistant chief walked away, Zeus finally relaxed, but only slightly. The dog turned to look at Marcus with what could only be described as expectation, as if waiting for his handler to finally understand what he'd been trying to communicate all along. Marcus started the engine with trembling hands, his mind racing, through the implications of what had just happened. Ray had been investigating something connected to the Henderson case. He'd discovered information that threatened someone powerful enough to have him killed. And somehow Zeus had detected the scent of that corruption at the memorial ceremony. The question now was whether Marcus had the courage to follow where his partner's instincts were leading, even if it meant confronting truths that could destroy everything he'd believed about the department he'd served for 23 years. The remainder of the shift passed in a blur of routine calls that felt anything but routine. Every radio transmission seemed potentially significant. Every interaction with fellow officers carried undertones of suspicion and doubt. Marcus found himself studying faces he'd known for years, wondering if Ray's killer might be someone he'd shared coffee with, someone he'd trusted to watch his back during dangerous situations. Zeus seemed to sense his handler's growing paranoia and stayed closer than usual, his presence both comforting and alarming. The dog's behavior during the ceremony had clearly been significant, but Marcus was struggling to understand exactly what Zeus had detected and how it connected to Ray's death. By late afternoon, Marcus had made a decision. He drove to Ray's widow's house, a modest two-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood where Ray had coached Little League and organized block parties. The house looked smaller somehow, diminished by grief and the absence of the man who'd filled it with laughter and energy. Nancy Hoffman answered the door with red-rimmed eyes and a forced smile that broke Marcus's heart. She'd aged years in the 6 months since Ray's death, her auburn hair now showing streaks of grey and her face bearing lines that hadn't been there before. "Marcus," she said, opening the door wider. "And Zeus, come in, please. The girls are at soccer practice, so we can talk." The living room was exactly as Marcus remembered it, except for the folded flag on the mantel and the framed photograph of Ray in his dress uniform. Zeus immediately went to his favorite spot on the rug near the fireplace, a behavior that brought tears to Nancy's eyes. "He always loved that spot," she whispered. "Ray used to joke that Zeus was more comfortable here than at home." Marcus settled into the chair across from Nancy, struggling to find the right words. "Nancy, I need to ask you about something Ray was working on before he died. The Henderson case. Do you remember him mentioning anything unusual about it?" Nancy's expression changed, becoming more alert and focused. "The domestic violence case. Yes, he was obsessing over it in the weeks before the shooting. Kept saying something didn't add up, that the evidence wasn't telling the whole story. Did he mention any specific concerns? Any particular aspect of the case that bothered him?" Nancy stood and walked to Ray's desk in the corner of the room, opening a drawer that appeared to have been untouched since his death. She pulled out a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. "He brought this home the week before he died," she said, handing the folder to Marcus. "Told me he needed to keep it somewhere safe, away from the station. He seemed scared." Marcus, really scared. Ray was never scared of anything. Marcus opened the folder with trembling hands, Zeus rising from his position on the rug to press against his leg. The first document was a copy of the official Henderson case report, but it was covered with Ray's handwritten notes in red ink. Question marks, circled discrepancies, arrows connecting seemingly unrelated details. The photographs showed the crime scene from multiple angles: Henderson's apartment after the hostage situation, the positioning of furniture, the location where Henderson's body had been found. But Ray had also included photographs that weren't part of the official file, shots taken from different vantage points that revealed details the formal investigation had missed. "Look at this," Marcus muttered, studying a photograph that showed the apartment's back entrance. According to the official report, Henderson had barricaded himself inside with his wife, refusing to let negotiators enter. But Ray's photograph clearly showed that the back door had been forced open from the outside. Its frame splintered in a way that suggested someone had broken in during the incident. Nancy leaned over his shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. Ray said the timeline didn't make sense. The official report claimed Henderson was killed during the rescue operation, but Ray found evidence that suggested he'd been dead for at least an hour before the SWAT team made entry. Marcus felt his stomach drop as the implications became clear. If Henderson had been killed before the official rescue operation, then someone else had been in that apartment, someone who'd had access to the scene, who'd been able to manipulate the evidence and control the narrative. Zeus suddenly stood and walked to the front window, his hackles rising as he stared out at the street. Marcus followed his gaze and saw a dark sedan parked across from Nancy's house, its occupants barely visible through tinted windows. "How long has that car been there?" Marcus asked. Nancy joined them at the window, her face going pale. I don't know. I hadn't noticed it before, but I've been getting strange phone calls lately. Hang-ups mostly, but sometimes someone just breathing on the other end." Marcus's phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Walk away now or join your friend." Zeus barked once, sharp and urgent, his attention fixed on the sedan, as if responding to some invisible signal. The car's engine started, and it pulled away from the curb, disappearing around the corner with practiced efficiency. "Nancy, you and the girls need to stay somewhere else tonight," Marcus said, his voice tight with urgency. "Pack a bag and go to your sister's house. Don't tell anyone where you're going." "Marcus, you're scaring me. What's going on?" Marcus looked down at the folder in his hands, at Ray's meticulous documentation of corruption that went deeper than either of them had imagined. Ray found something that got him killed, and now whoever killed him knows that we're getting close to the truth. Zeus returned to Marcus's side, pressing against his leg with reassuring warmth, but the dog's ears remained alert, his body language suggesting that danger was still nearby, still watching, still waiting for the right moment to strike. As Nancy hurried upstairs to pack, Marcus studied the photographs more carefully, his trained eye picking up details that painted a picture of conspiracy and murder. Ray had been methodical in his investigation, building a case that would have exposed corruption at the highest levels of the department, but someone had silenced him before he could present his evidence. Someone with the power to orchestrate his death and cover it up as a random act of violence. Someone who'd been at the memorial ceremony, close enough for Zeus to detect their scent, their guilt, their fear. The folder contained one final document that made Marcus's blood run cold. A.T. Handwritten note in Ray's careful script. "If something happens to me, trust the dog. Zeus knows who can't be trusted. He's been trying to warn us all along." Marcus looked down at his partner, who gazed back with those intelligent dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets beyond human understanding. Ray had somehow known that Zeus would be the key to unraveling the conspiracy, that the dog's instincts would prove more reliable than any human investigation. The question now was whether Marcus had the courage to follow Zeus's lead, even if it meant confronting enemies who'd already proven they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. As Nancy came downstairs with a hastily packed suitcase, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He was going to that midnight meeting at Riverside Park, but he wouldn't be going alone. Zeus would be with him, and together they would finally learn the truth about Ray's death, no matter what the cost. The sun was setting as they left Nancy's house, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that every move was being monitored by enemies who stayed hidden in the darkness. But Zeus seemed calmer now, as if sensing that his handler had finally understood the message he'd been trying to deliver. The dog's tail wagged once, briefly, in what Marcus chose to interpret as approval. Whatever happened at midnight, they would face it together, partners to the end, just as Ray would have wanted. Riverside Park at midnight was a landscape of shadows and whispered secrets. The ancient oak trees created pockets of darkness that seemed to breathe with malevolent life, and the distant sound of water lapping against the dock provided an ominous soundtrack to what Marcus knew would be the most dangerous night of his career. Zeus moved beside him with predatory grace. Every sense alert to potential threats. The dog had been unusually calm during the drive to the park, as if he understood that they were finally approaching the moment he'd been preparing for since the memorial ceremony. His breathing was steady, controlled, but Marcus could feel the coiled tension in his partner's muscles. They approached the designated meeting spot, a weathered picnic table near the old boat launch, where Marcus had brought his nephew fishing just last summer. The normalcy of the memory felt surreal against the current circumstances, a reminder of how quickly life could shift from peaceful routine to mortal danger. A figure emerged from the darkness near the water's edge, and Marcus felt his blood turn to ice as he recognized Assistant Chief Harold Brennan. But Brennan wasn't alone. Councilman Robert Vance stepped out from behind a cluster of willows, and with him came two men Marcus didn't recognize, their military bearing and concealed weapons marking them as professional enforcers. "Officer Sullivan," Brennan called softly, his voice carrying easily across the still night air. "I'm glad you came, and I see you brought Zeus. Smart choice. That dog of yours has been causing us considerable concern." Marcus kept his hand near his service weapon, while Zeus positioned himself slightly ahead, creating a protective barrier between his handler and the approaching men. The dog's hackles were up, but he remained silent, his training overriding his instincts for the moment. "You killed Ray," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "You killed my partner because he found out about Henderson." Brennan's expression was almost sympathetic. Ray was a good detective, too good for his own welfare. He couldn't leave well enough alone. Vance stepped forward, his politician's smile grotesque in the moonlight. The Henderson case was perfectly managed until Detective Hoffman started asking inconvenient questions. Sometimes the greater good requires difficult choices. "What greater good?" Marcus demanded. "Henderson was a wife-beater who deserved to be in prison. What could possibly justify covering up his murder?" Brennan and Vance exchanged glances before the assistant chief answered. "Henderson wasn't just a domestic abuser, Sullivan. He was our informant, had been for 3 years. The information he provided helped us shut down drug operations worth millions of dollars, saved dozens of lives, prevented crimes that would have devastated this community." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. "So you killed him to protect your informant network?" "We didn't kill Henderson," Vance said quietly, "but we didn't prevent his death either. Henderson had become unreliable, dangerous. He was threatening to expose the entire operation unless we got the charges against him dropped. His wife wasn't his first victim. He'd killed before, and he was planning to kill again." Brennan took up the narrative. "One of our undercover operations went wrong. Henderson discovered that his handler was actually DEA, not just another criminal. He killed Agent Maria Santos in his apartment, then staged the domestic violence call to create a cover story." Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. "So you let him die to cover up a federal agent's murder?" "We let justice take its course," Brennan corrected. "Henderson was going to spend the rest of his life in prison anyway if he'd lived. This way, Agent Santos's family got closure. The drug operation stayed intact, and a dangerous killer was removed permanently." Zeus had been listening to the conversation with that uncanny intelligence Marcus had learned to recognize over the years. Suddenly the dog took 3 deliberate steps forward and sat down directly in front of Vance, his dark eyes fixed on the councilman with laser intensity. "Your dog seems to have an opinion about our discussion," Vance observed nervously. Marcus watched Zeus carefully, remembering Ray's final note about trusting the dog's instincts. There was something specific about Vance that had triggered Zeus's alertness at the ceremony, something beyond the general corruption they'd just revealed. "Zeus, search," Marcus commanded, using the signal for narcotics detection. The dog immediately went to work, circling Vance with professional precision. Within seconds, Zeus sat and placed his paw on the councilman's left ankle, the signal for concealed contraband. "Interesting," Marcus said, his voice hardening. "City Councilman Robert, Vance is carrying drugs to a clandestine meeting in the middle of the night. I wonder what the voters would think about that." Vance's carefully composed expression cracked. "This is ridiculous. That animal is obviously malfunctioning." But Zeus wasn't finished. The dog moved to Brennan and repeated the search, this time alerting on the assistant chief's jacket pocket. Then, in a display that made Marcus's heart race with pride and terror, Zeus walked to each of the two enforcers and alerted on both of them. Well, Marcus said, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "Looks like we have a regular drug trafficking convention here tonight." Brennan's sympathetic demeanor evaporated. "You don't understand the complexity of the situation, Sullivan. The Henderson case was just the beginning. We've been running a controlled distribution network for 2 years. Clean product, managed territories, reduced violence. Street crime is down 30% in this city because of our work." The admission was so brazen that Marcus almost couldn't process it. "You're running drugs? You're actually dealing narcotics?" "We're managing the inevitable," Vance said defensively. "Drug trafficking is going to happen whether we participate or not. This way, we control the quality, prevent overdoses, and use the profits to fund programs that traditional budgets can't support." "What programs?" Marcus demanded. Brennan pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a series of photographs, new equipment. For the police department, upgraded vehicles, body armor, and weapons that far exceeded what the city budget could provide. "Every officer in this department has benefited from our supplemental funding, including you, Sullivan. That new radio system that saved your life during the warehouse fire last year? Drug money paid for it." Marcus felt sick as the implications sank in. The entire department had been unknowingly supported by criminal profits. Every piece of equipment, every technological upgrade, every improvement in officer safety had been purchased with blood money. "Ray found out," Marcus said, more to himself than to the others. "Ray found shipping manifests that didn't match the official purchases," Brennan confirmed. "He started tracing the money, asking questions about budget allocations that weren't reflected in city records. He was 3 days away from presenting evidence to Internal Affairs, when we had to make a difficult choice." Zeus suddenly barked once, sharp and urgent, his attention focused on the darkness beyond the picnic area. Marcus followed his gaze and saw additional figures emerging from concealment, at least 6 more armed men positioning themselves to surround the meeting site. "You never intended to let me walk away from this," Marcus realized. Vance shrugged. "You know too much now, and that dog of yours is too dangerous to leave alive. Zeus has always been too smart, too observant. We should have dealt with him months ago." The threat against Zeus triggered something primal in Marcus's protective instincts. His hand moved to his weapon, but he stopped when he realized they were outnumbered 8-1, with Zeus as the only backup he could count on. "There's another option," Brennan said, his voice taking on a persuasive tone. "Join us. Your skills, Zeus's abilities, you could be valuable partners in maintaining order in this city. The alternative is that you end up like Ray, another tragic casualty of a dangerous job." Marcus looked down at Zeus, who was watching him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom in the world. The dog's expression was calm but alert, waiting for his handler's decision, ready to follow wherever Marcus chose to lead. In that moment, Marcus understood what Ray had tried to tell him in his final moments. This wasn't just about corruption or drug trafficking or even murder. It was about the fundamental choice between serving justice and serving convenience, between protecting the innocent and protecting the system. "I've already made my choice," Marcus said quietly. "Ray made his choice too, and Zeus has been trying to tell me what the right choice is since the memorial ceremony." Brennan sighed with what appeared to be genuine regret. "Then I'm sorry, Sullivan. You're a good officer. This doesn't have to be painful." One of the enforcers raised his weapon, but before he could take aim, Zeus exploded into motion with a ferocity that Marcus had never seen before. The dog launched himself at the nearest gunman. 80 pounds of muscle and loyalty transformed into a living weapon defending his partner. The night erupted into chaos as Marcus drew his service weapon and dove behind the picnic table, using it as cover, while Zeus engaged multiple attackers with breathtaking courage and skill. The sound of gunfire echoed across the water, but Zeus seemed to anticipate every threat, moving with supernatural grace between shadows and moonlight. City. Gunfight lasted less than 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. Marcus had found good cover behind the picnic table and was returning fire when he realized that Zeus had systematically disabled 3 of the enforcers without killing any of them. The dog's training in suspect apprehension had kicked in, and he was treating this as an arrest situation rather than a life-or-death battle. "Zeus, defensive!" Marcus shouted, using the command that would signal his partner to prioritize protection over pursuit. The dog immediately fell back to Marcus's position, his flanks heaving but his eyes still alert for additional threats. 2 of the enforcers were on the ground, one clutching a mangled arm where Zeus had applied precise pressure to disarm him, the other curled in a fetal position after taking a shoulder strike that had separated his collarbone. Brennan and Vance had taken cover behind their vehicle, but they were trapped between Marcus's position and the water. The remaining enforcers were maintaining defensive positions, but their body language suggested they were reassessing the situation now that Zeus had proven to be a more formidable opponent than they'd anticipated. "Sullivan!" Brennan called out. "This doesn't have to end badly for everyone. We can make a deal." "The only deal I'm interested in is you surrendering and confessing to Ray's murder," Marcus replied, checking his ammunition while keeping Zeus close. "You're outnumbered and outgunned," Vance shouted. "Be reasonable." Zeus suddenly went rigid, his head cocked at an angle that Marcus recognized as his listening posture. The dog had detected something beyond the immediate threat, additional sounds, movements or scents that weren't immediately apparent to human senses. Then Marcus heard it too, the distant wail of sirens approaching from multiple directions. Someone had called in the gunfire and the cavalry was on its way. "You called for backup," Brennan accused, his voice tight with anger. "I didn't call anyone," Marcus replied honestly. He'd come to the meeting intending to handle the situation alone, not wanting to risk additional officers until he understood the full scope of the corruption. Zeus barked twice, his signal for E. Friendly personnel approaching. The dog's acute hearing had identified the specific sound signatures of police vehicles, and his training allowed him to distinguish between legitimate law enforcement response and potential threats. Captain Morrison's voice echoed across the park from a police PA system. "This is the Metro Police Department. The area is surrounded. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." Marcus felt a surge of relief mixed with concern. Morrison was trustworthy. She'd always supported the K9 program and had never been involved in the corruption Brennan and Vance had described. But he wasn't sure how much she knew about the situation or whether other responding officers might be compromised. "Morrison," Marcus called out. "Officer Sullivan and Zeus, we have multiple armed suspects and need medical assistance." "Marcus, are you injured?" Morrison's voice carried clearly in the still night air. "We're okay, but we have wounded suspects and a complex situation here." Brennan made a decision that surprised everyone. Standing up from his position behind the vehicle, he dropped his weapon and raised his hands above his head. "I surrender," he called out. "Assistant Chief Harold Brennan surrendering to responding officers." Vance followed suit, though his expression suggested he was calculating political angles rather than accepting defeat. The remaining enforcers looked uncertain, but the arrival of additional police vehicles convinced them that resistance was futile. As uniformed officers swarmed the scene, Zeus remained alert but calm, his training telling him that the immediate danger had passed. Marcus kept one hand on his partner's head, drawing comfort from the dog's steady presence, while his mind raced through the implications of what had just been revealed. Detective Chen was among the first officers to reach Marcus's position. "What the hell happened here?" she asked, taking in the scene of wounded suspects and scattered weapons. "Long story," Marcus replied, "but the short version is that Ray's death wasn't random. He was killed because he uncovered a drug trafficking operation run by department leadership." Chen's expression went through a range of emotions: disbelief, anger, and finally grim acceptance. "How deep does it go?" Deep enough to compromise equipment purchases and operations funding for the entire department, Marcus said. Zeus detected something wrong at the memorial ceremony, and he's been trying to tell me about it ever since. As if understanding that he was being discussed, Zeus walked over to Chen and sat directly in front of her, his tail wagging once in recognition of someone he trusted. The gesture was small but significant. Zeus's endorsement carried weight in the K9 unit, and his approval of Chen suggested she wasn't part of the corruption. Captain Morrison approached, her expression grave as she surveyed the aftermath of the confrontation. Marcus, I need you to walk me through everything that happened here, and I need to understand how Zeus knew to alert on these suspects. Marcus looked down at his partner, who gazed back with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold secrets beyond human understanding. Zeus has been trying to tell us something since Ray's funeral. Dogs can smell guilt, fear, deception, things we miss because we're too focused on what people say instead of what they're hiding. Are you telling me that Zeus identified corrupt officers by scent? I'm telling you that Zeus has instincts that go beyond his training. Ray figured it out before he died. That's why he wrote that note about trusting the dog. Zeus has been protecting us from threats we didn't even know existed. As the crime scene was processed and statements were taken, Marcus found himself thinking about Ray's final moments. His friend had tried to communicate something important, something that might have prevented his death if Marcus had understood the message. But Ray's investigation had ultimately succeeded. The evidence he'd gathered, combined with Zeus's instinctive detection of corruption, had exposed a conspiracy that went to the highest levels of law enforcement. The wounded enforcers were transported to the hospital under police guard, while Brennan and Vance were arrested on charges ranging from drug trafficking to conspiracy to commit murder. Marcus knew that the legal proceedings would be complex and lengthy, but the foundation of their case was solid. As dawn began to break over Riverside Park, Marcus sat on the picnic table that had provided life-saving cover during the gunfight. Zeus had positioned himself at his handler's feet, finally relaxed after hours of hypervigilance. You knew, Marcus said quietly, scratching behind Zeus's ears. From the very beginning, you knew something was wrong. I should have listened to you sooner. Zeus looked up at him with what Marcus chose to interpret as forgiveness, his tail wagging gently in the morning light. The story broke on the morning news with the kind of explosive impact that changed everything instantly. Police Dog Exposes Corruption Network became the headline that dominated every media outlet in the city. And by noon, Zeus had become the most famous K9 officer in the country. Marcus found himself thrust into a spotlight he'd never wanted, fielding calls from reporters, federal investigators, and law enforcement agencies from across the nation. The story of how a German shepherd's instincts had unraveled a multi-million-dollar corruption scheme captured public imagination in ways that traditional police work rarely achieved. The police station was in chaos. Internal Affairs had launched a comprehensive investigation that would ultimately involve every member of the department. Federal agents had seized financial records going back 3 years, and the Drug Enforcement Administration had opened its own inquiry into the murder of Agent Maria Santos. Commissioner Roberts, who had been cleared of any involvement in the corruption, called a press conference that was broadcast live across the region. Marcus stood beside him, Zeus sitting at perfect attention, while camera flashes created a strobe light effect that would have been overwhelming for most dogs. Today marks a dark chapter in the history of our department, Roberts began, his voice heavy with emotion. But it also demonstrates the power of integrity, courage, and the unbreakable bond between officers and their K9 partners. The crowd of reporters was unusually quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment. Roberts continued, Officer Marcus Sullivan and his partner Zeus have exemplified the highest standards of law enforcement. Their dedication to justice, even in the face of mortal danger, represents the best of what we strive to be as public servants. A reporter from the local television station raised her hand. Commissioner, is it true that Zeus actually identified corrupt officers by scent during the memorial ceremony? Roberts looked down at Zeus, who remained motionless despite the chaos around him. What I can tell you is that K9 officers are trained to detect things that human officers might miss. Zeus's behavior at the memorial ceremony led to questions that ultimately uncovered criminal activity within our own ranks. Another reporter pressed for details. What's the scope of the corruption? How many officers were involved? The investigation is ongoing, Roberts replied. But I can confirm that the conspiracy involved high-ranking personnel who violated their oaths and betrayed the trust of the community they swore to protect. After the press conference, Marcus and Zeus retreated to the relative quiet of the K9 training facility. Captain Morrison found them there, Zeus going through his usual exercise routine while Marcus tried to process the magnitude of what had happened. "How are you holding up?" Morrison asked, settling onto a bench beside the training course. "I keep thinking about Ray," Marcus admitted. "He died trying to expose this conspiracy, and it took Zeus to finish what he started. I should have understood what was happening sooner. Ray's investigation provided the foundation," Morrison pointed out. "Without his evidence, Zeus's alerts would have been meaningless. You two made a good team, even after he was gone." Zeus finished his obstacle course and trotted over to them, his tongue lolling out in what Marcus had learned to recognize as his version of a smile. The dog seemed to understand that the immediate danger had passed, but his alertness remained, heightened, a reminder that trust, once broken, would take time to rebuild. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. Morrison considered the question carefully. "Internal Affairs will interview every member of the department. Some careers will end, some officers will face criminal charges, and all of us will have to rebuild the community's trust from the ground up. And Zeus? Zeus is a hero," Morrison said simply. "The department's going to make sure everyone knows it." As if understanding that he was being discussed, Zeus walked over and placed his head on Marcus's knee, a gesture of comfort that had become familiar over their years of partnership. The simple act of connection grounded Marcus in a way that all the praise and media attention couldn't match. That evening, Marcus received a phone call that changed everything again. Nancy Hoffman was crying, but for the first time in months they were tears of relief rather than grief. "Marcus, I watched the news. Ray would be so proud of you and Zeus. You finished what he started." "We all finished it," Marcus corrected. "Ray, Zeus, even you, keeping those files safe gave us the evidence we needed." "There's something else," Nancy said. "Something I didn't tell you yesterday. Ray left something for Zeus. He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to Zeus as a thank you for being such a good partner." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "What is it?" "His favorite tennis ball. The one he used to bring to the station for Zeus during break time. He said Zeus earned it." The image of Ray playing fetch with Zeus during their lunch breaks brought back a flood of memories that Marcus had been trying to suppress. His partner's death had left a hole in so many lives, but somehow Zeus had found a way to honor Ray's memory while protecting everyone Ray had cared about. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the same spot where the memorial ceremony had taken place, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. The city had organized a special recognition ceremony for Zeus, and hundreds of people had gathered to honor the K9 officer who'd become a symbol of integrity and courage. The corruption investigation had resulted in 17 arrests, including Brennan and Vance, who were facing federal charges that would likely result in life sentences. The drug trafficking network had been dismantled, and the department was slowly rebuilding its reputation under new leadership. Zeus wore a special ceremonial collar for the occasion, his posture proud but relaxed as he acknowledged the applause of the crowd. Marcus had never seen his partner so comfortable with public attention. It was as if Zeus understood that his actions had made a difference, that justice had been served. Commissioner Roberts approached the podium, carrying a wooden box that Marcus recognized as containing the department's highest honor, the Medal of Valor, rarely awarded and never before given to a K9 officer. Today we honor not just exceptional police work, but the kind of loyalty and courage that defines the very best of law enforcement, Roberts began. Zeus and Officer Sullivan risked their lives to expose corruption and bring justice to our community. The medal was specially designed for Zeus, a collar attachment that featured the department's seal surrounded by a wreath of oak leaves. As Roberts placed it around Zeus's neck, the dog sat perfectly still, seeming to understand the solemnity of the moment. "This medal represents more than recognition," Roberts continued. "It represents our commitment to the values that Zeus and Officer Sullivan defended: integrity, courage, and the unwavering dedication to protecting those who cannot protect themselves." The crowd erupted in applause, but Zeus's attention was focused on something else entirely. Nancy Hoffman had approached from the audience, carrying Ray's old tennis ball, faded and worn from years of use, but preserved as a memorial to their friendship. Zeus's tail began wagging as he recognized the familiar object, and when Nancy placed it at his feet, the dog gently picked it up and carried it back to Marcus. The gesture was simple but profound, a symbol of continuity, of bonds that transcended death, of the way love and loyalty could survive even the worst tragedies. Marcus knelt beside his partner, one hand resting on Zeus's flank while the other held the tennis ball that represented so much more than a simple toy. "Ray would be proud of you, boy. You finished what he started." Zeus looked up at him with those intelligent eyes that had seen too much but never stopped believing in the possibility of justice. His tail wagged once briefly in acknowledgement. Detective Chen, who'd been promoted to lead the newly formed anti-corruption unit, approached with a folder of documents. "Marcus, I wanted you to know, we found additional evidence in Ray's files. He'd been investigating other cases, other instances where the corruption network had manipulated evidence or intimidated witnesses." "How many cases?" "At least 30 over the past 5 years. We're reopening all of them, and Zeus's testimony, his ability to identify the subjects by scent, is going to be crucial in several prosecutions." Marcus felt a chill as he realized the full scope of what Ray had uncovered. 30 cases meant 30 families who'd been denied justice, 30 criminals who'd avoided accountability, 30 examples of the system failing the people it was supposed to protect. "Zeus and I will help however we can," Marcus said. "Ray deserves to have all his work validated." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Marcus and Zeus walked to the memorial wall where Ray's name had been engraved 6 months earlier. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble, and Marcus placed Ray's tennis ball at the base of the wall as a private tribute. Zeus sat beside the memorial for several minutes, his head tilted in the listening posture that Marcus had come to recognize as the dog's way of processing complex emotions. Then, without any command or signal, Zeus stood and performed his signature military salute, right paw raised to his forehead, held for exactly 3 seconds, then lowered with ceremonial precision. But this time the salute wasn't directed at corrupt officials or hidden enemies. It was for Ray, for the memory of a good man who died trying to do the right thing, for the bond between partners that death couldn't break. Marcus felt tears on his cheeks as he watched his partner honor their fallen friend. "Thank you," he whispered, not sure if he was speaking to Zeus to Ray's memory or to whatever force in the universe had brought them all together. Zeus looked up at him with what Marcus chose to interpret as understanding, then picked up the tennis ball and carried it as they walked back toward their patrol car. The symbolic gesture completed a circle that had begun with Ray's investigation and ended with justice served and honor restored. That night, Marcus sat on his front porch with Zeus lying contentedly at his feet, the Medal of Valor glinting in the porch light. The phone had been ringing all day with interview requests and speaking invitations, but Marcus had ignored most of them. The story they'd uncovered was important, but the real heroes were the ones who'd paid the ultimate price. For truth. Zeus suddenly raised his head, his ears perked at attention. Marcus followed his gaze and saw a familiar figure walking up the sidewalk, Nancy Hoffman carrying a plate covered with aluminum foil. "I thought you two might be hungry," she said, settling into the chair beside Marcus. "And I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done." Zeus's tail wagged as he recognized Nancy, and she reached down to scratch behind his ears with the familiarity of someone who'd shared countless evenings like this when Ray was alive. "Ray always said Zeus was special," Nancy continued. "He used to joke that the dog was smarter than half the detectives in the department. Turns out he was right about more than he knew." Marcus uncovered the plate to reveal homemade cookies, Ray's favorite recipe that Nancy had made for him throughout their marriage. The gesture was small but profound, a way of keeping Ray's memory alive while acknowledging the new relationships that had grown from tragedy. As they sat in comfortable silence, Zeus positioned himself so that he could see both Marcus and Nancy, his presence bridging past and present in the way that only dogs seemed able to do. The corruption had been exposed, justice had been served, and life was slowly returning to something resembling normal. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Marcus and Zeus were patrolling the same neighborhoods where their partnership had begun 8 years earlier. The corruption scandal had faded from the headlines, replaced by newer stories and different crises, but the changes it had brought to the department remained profound and lasting. Zeus was showing his age now, graying around the muzzle, moving, with slightly less explosive energy, content to let Marcus handle more of the routine interactions, while he conserved his strength for situations that truly required his expertise. But his instincts remained as sharp as ever, his loyalty as unwavering as the day they'd first been partnered. They were driving past Riverside Park when Zeus suddenly barked once, not his alert signal, not his warning bark, but something softer, more contemplative. Marcus pulled over and looked toward the picnic area where their final confrontation with Brennan and Vance had taken place. The park looked peaceful in the morning light, showing no signs of the violence that had occurred there. Families were already arriving for weekend activities, children running toward playground equipment, while parents unpacked picnic lunches. Life had moved on, as it always does, but the echoes of that night remained embedded in the landscape of Marcus's memory. Zeus got out of the patrol car and walked to the exact spot where the old picnic table had stood, now replaced with a newer model that bore no scars from gunfire. The dog sat down and looked out over the water, his expression thoughtful in the way that only dogs seem capable of achieving. Marcus joined him, settling onto the bench while Zeus positioned himself at his feet. The autumn air carried the scent of changing leaves and distant wood smoke, peaceful fragrances that seemed to wash away the lingering shadows of corruption and betrayal. "You did good, boy," Marcus said quietly, his hand resting on Zeus's head. "Ray would be proud of both of us." Zeus looked up at him with those intelligent eyes that had seen too much, but never stopped believing in the possibility of justice. His tail wagged once, gently, in acknowledgement of praise from the human he'd chosen to protect and serve. As they sat together in the place where truth had finally triumphed over deception, Marcus understood that their partnership had become something larger than either of them individually. They'd become a symbol of the way loyalty and courage could overcome even the most entrenched corruption, the way simple integrity could shine light into the darkest corners of institutional failure. Zeus suddenly stood and walked to the water's edge, where he sat down and performed his signature military salute one final time. But this wasn't directed at any memorial or ceremony. It was simply an expression of respect for the fallen, for the battles fought and won, for the sacred duty that bound them all together. The salute lasted exactly 3 seconds, as always. Then Zeus lowered his paw and returned to Marcus's side. They sat together in comfortable silence, two partners who'd learned that sometimes the most important truths can only be discovered by trusting instincts that go deeper than training, deeper than procedure, deeper than the comfortable lies that make corruption possible. In the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, its clear notes carrying across the water like a benediction. Marcus and Zeus rose together, ready to continue their patrol, ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring. As they walked back toward their patrol car, Zeus carried himself with the quiet dignity of an old soldier who'd completed his most important mission. His steps were measured but confident, his bearing proud but not arrogant, the embodiment of service without expectation of reward. Marcus opened the car door, and Zeus jumped into his familiar position in the passenger seat, settling in for another day of protecting and serving. As they drove away from Riverside Park, Marcus caught sight of Zeus in the rearview mirror, the dog's profile silhouetted against the morning light. He never needed to salute again, not because he couldn't, but because he had already spoken every truth that mattered, in the only language that corruption couldn't silence, the pure, unwavering voice of loyalty itself.